Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT, SAT, and CLT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT test. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exam. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, be sure to use the code podcast for 10% off. Now, let's get started. Today we have Lori Goldstein from Circle Test Prep with us, and Lori, I'd love if you could just introduce yourself and your company.
Sure. I'm located in South Florida, between Miami and Fort Lauderdale. I've been teaching ACT and SAT prep for about 14 years now. And it's always interesting. I will tell you that.
Yeah, and it's been a it's been interesting recently for sure.
Yeah.
Well, excited to chat with you about today's topic. I actually am quite curious about this, right? Like, how do the math sections for the ACT and SAT differ? And yeah, when you think about this, like, what is the first thing that comes to mind?
So they differ a lot, and parents are, surprised, understandably, to find that it's actually different. They're like, well, isn't it high school math? Yeah, it's high school math. I would say the first thing that comes to mind to answer your question is the SAT is sort of deep and theoretical, and sort of brain teasers in many ways. And the ACT resembles the math you've been doing in school more closely, but it covers a lot more territory.
Yeah, I've heard that too, that the scope of the SAT is a lot more narrow, but then that also means that in order for them to make harder problems, you've got to kind of get into the weeds in some of these areas.
Oh yeah, get into the weeds, or just it sort of make you think and then think again. They can be very tricky. If you like puzzles, the SAT's great.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's dig into and unpack that a little bit. So when you say, let's I guess start with the ACT. So when you say that the ACT kind of is like the math you do in school, what do you mean by that? Just that there's like kind of no surprises in terms, like, yeah, what does that mean?
Well, there's no, I shouldn't say there's no trickiness. They all have a tricky element to them, but they don't tend to extend into sort of the theoretical understanding of how equations work and what they all mean and how does it all relate to other equations. How do linear equations relate to quadratic equations and relate to exponential equations? And that's sort of the in the weeds stuff that you'll see in the SAT. More, it's more like, okay, here's a problem, solve it, without you having to have a greater theoretical understanding of how the mathematics itself is working.
Got it. Okay. So then what do you feel like, yeah, I guess when it comes to the SAT, like, maybe the best way to ask this is like, how do they make the harder questions hard, right? Like, do they, like, because we're talking a little bit about like it incorporates logic or things like that, but do you have like an example just off the top of your head or something that you can kind of help demonstrate that with?
Yeah, I mean, what they will do is they would give you a question that you would normally see in high school, except instead of giving you numbers for A and B, they'll say A and B equal P and Q. They're constants and they're both less than 0. Right? So instead of, they replace a lot of the numbers with constants, with letters, to make it harder. That's one way they do it. So you can't just, do the math. You really have to understand what you're doing. It's very hard to explain. They're really good at coming up with difficult theoretical questions. I mean, I've written a lot of test questions myself, but I don't hold a candle to these guys.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff they come up with.
Well, yeah, they're definitely. I mean, that's their job, right? Your job is to teach to it.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, so that's, I mean, it's, I mean, to give you an example, I'll just give you an example from a question I just did with a student earlier today. Part of the text said that gave you a point, P plus Q, comma 0. That was one of the points on the line. And then,
Mm-hmm.
like in the next sentence, it said, the y-intercept is 0. Okay, so the
Mm-hmm.
y-intercept, then you have to make the leap. Okay, so the y-intercept is where x equals 0. Okay, and therefore, if p plus q comma 0 is the y-intercept, then p plus q has to equal 0 as well. Okay, which means they're 2 and -2 or 8 and -8. And once you had that down and you understood that P and Q had to be the same number, positive and negative, only then could you solve the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you basically, if you didn't like follow their logic and get through the sort of that part of the problem, there'd be no way to solve it,
No.
essentially.
No, if you didn't catch the fact that that's the y-intercept. The y-intercept means x equals 0, which means P plus Q equals 0. If you didn't get those steps in order, you would have no way to solve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that sounds like it can be a lot more like just challenging to prepare for. I mean, how do you recommend like that people prepare differently for the two tests, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have different coursework, I have different practice, I have different practice questions. It's totally different courses for each test. That's
Mm-hmm.
my take on it.
Yeah, I guess more like obviously definitely need to have like different courses and things like that, but I more mean like do you have sort of different strategies, right? Like for people at home, like if they're preparing for the SAT, are there certain things that they should make sure that they're studying or versus the ACT?
Well, I would personally, the best thing to do is to practice with the real material, and there's
Mm-hmm.
plenty of good free material on Khan Academy. That's a good place to start so that you're
Mm-hmm.
used to the way these questions are put together. Once you kind of, get used to it, then it's a little bit less challenging. But going in cold, I would never recommend it. Always do some preparation before you take your first test. And to me, it's the same with the ACT. You want to practice it, right? You can't, you need to see how they write the questions, how they phrase the questions. Just get used to the way the questions look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you feel like the either the SAT or the ACT has like a tricky problem type that the other one doesn't have that needs special attention?
Hmm. Problem type. Hmm. There's, yeah,
Yeah,
well,
or subject, yeah.
yeah, I mean, there are definitely differences, but every time I think they do tend to copy each other a little bit. So sometimes you'll see something on the ACT and you're like, oh, that looks, look not exactly phrased the same way, but it's the same sort of thing as the SAT's been doing for a bit. The SAT leans heavily on exponential equations and percentages and
Mm-hmm.
understanding how those equations are written. And I don't see much of
Mm-hmm.
that in the ACT. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the ACT, of course, has, things that you don't see in the SAT, like imaginary numbers and, conics and vectors and all of that. other material as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there are some categories that are definitely bigger and smaller in each one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the weighting is definitely super important, right? Like understanding sort of what types of problems you're more likely to see. I mean, do you feel like there's a difference in what's like the most common types of problems on each test?
Um, they both have a large contingent of, basic linear algebra 1, even the SAT,
Hmm.
except it's harder it's not harder, it's more theoretical on the SAT. So you really have to
Hmm.
know your y equals mx plus b, backwards, forwards,
Hmm.
inside and out, for both of the tests. Um, there's maybe a little bit more geometry also on the ACT. So,
Hmm.
you know, that can make a difference to some students who are either really good with geometry or not really good with geometry. Um,
Hmm.
but no, I mean, again, but then the ACT covers so much more of the material that you would see in an advanced algebra 2 or pre-calculus class. You won't really see that. I mean, there's never been a vector question on SAT math.
Right. Yeah, so you almost have to know like a bit more math for the ACT, but at least you can take some solace that like the questions are going to be what they're going to be, and they're not going to be trying to trick you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's somebody said it's like wide and shallow for the ACT,
Hmm.
and smaller and deeper for the SAT.
Yeah. And I was curious, like, how do you think the way that the sections are structured changes things? And what I mean by that is that the ACT math, it's well known that like the first problem is the easiest and the last problem is the hardest, roughly. Versus, I don't feel like that's how the SAT is built.
No,
And I
it is.
also,
It
now that
is.
there's the adaptive section, I wonder about how that's changed.
No, they both module 1 and module 2, whether you get the harder or easier one for 2, they tend to start out
Hmm.
with the easier questions and build to the harder questions. That
Okay.
that is now, it's never a straight linear progression, and neither is it in the ACT. Sometimes you'll get a harder question a little bit earlier than you think it should appear, vice versa. But yeah, they start out easy, kind of warm up on the easier stuff, and then get to the harder stuff at the end. And a lot of students have trouble finishing. They get the harder module, especially finishing the second math module. But then a lot of
Hmm.
students have trouble finishing the math in the ACT as well.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, most students in the ACT are usually kind of rushing through those last few questions.
yeah, and that's not necessarily going to affect their score that greatly, as you probably know.
Yeah. I'm curious, when it comes to like the length of the sections, right? I mean, now that the SAT math is kind of broken into two parts versus the ACT is not, like, do you feel like that has an impact on kind of which one's easier or harder, just because one of them's a little bit more of a marathon?
Well, yeah, the marathon aspect of the ACT is something that you have to get used to. Once the kids are used to doing it, they can do it. The students do tend to prefer it seems they prefer shorter. At least they think they prefer shorter until they get their
Right.
scores back, and sometimes they see, no, I should stick with the ACT. Um,
Hmm.
but yes, it does go by more quickly, and high school students will take a 2-hour test over a 3-hour test any day, right?
Right.
Until they get their scores, and then they might change their mind.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Um,
breaking it up, it doesn't really break up. I mean, you have a short intermission while the second part loads, but it's only a minute or so. Then you go right into the
yeah,
second
it's
part.
not really that much. How do you feel about also, I think another kind of major difference is that the new digital SAT uses the Demos calculator, right?
Hmm.
do you feel like that has an impact? Because I know that there are definitely some problem types on the SAT that the calculator can just like solve if you know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, it's interesting that they put that on there. I'm not quite sure, um, whether that was a good idea for testing math knowledge or not. But yes, the kids have access to the Desmos, and they should always know how to operate it, and have some practice with it. But it's not just going to solve all the problems for the students. They're quickly figuring out that just mastering Desmos, in my opinion, is not the way to ensure a good score, because again, they put in all those letters instead of numbers, right? So if
Hmm.
you've got, you know, four different constants and two variables, you can't put that into Desmos. You don't know, or you might
Right.
figure it out, but by the time you do, time's up.
Yeah, and realistically, I mean, they're building problems now with Desmos in mind. So I would
Hmm.
imagine that the number of problems that you can solve with Desmos is probably going to go down.
Yeah, I'm using it less than I thought that I would with my students. Um, and I've heard from other tutors as well that they're using it less than they thought they would. So
Hmm.
it's a great tool for some questions, but if you don't know how to do the math with a pencil, then you're in trouble.
Right. Yeah. And then I'm kind of in like I think the next place that I want to take this is so when you're talking to potential clients or current clients and they're kind of debating between the ACT and the SAT, particularly, which one they're going to get a better score on the math section for. What kind of process do you go through with them to figure out which test they should take and kind of what are the factors that go into that?
Mm. Okay, well, part of it, I always ask them, do they read quickly? Are they, one of the
Hmm.
first in their class to finish a test when a test is given, or are they one of the last? Because if
Hmm.
they're not quick, I don't think the ACT is great. Although with practice, they all get quicker.
Hmm.
Um, you know, it's a very difficult thing. Some kids have a real preference, so I'll just go with their preference usually because,
Yeah.
you gotta have them at least not actually exactly hate taking their practice tests.
Yeah.
Um,
It
yeah,
turns out the number one predictor of improving your score is just actually doing the work, right?
yeah, exactly. So, if there's one test they absolutely can't stand, then we'll just do the other one. But, you know, it's it seems to be for students who are a little bit less strong in math, sometimes they want to take the ACT because it's literally a fourth of their score instead of a half.
Mm,
But it all can be taught. It all can be
right.
learned. Um, so it's not easy to pick. But I look at their speed quite easily. Sometimes I'll have them come to my place, and I'll sort of give them, what I call a half a test, like a half of an English section, a half a math section, and time them, and I give them a couple of pointers, but no more, and see
Hmm.
how they do. And if they can basically finish it, um, or almost finish it, then I'm feeling pretty good, unless they get a whole bunch of them wrong.
Right. Got it. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, the ACT does take some of the math concepts and kind of put them in the science section, right? Though it's not exactly math as much as finding data. So, I mean, do you think there's validity to the idea that, oh, if I'm not so good at math, I should do the ACT because it's a quarter of my score? Or do you think that's kind of a silly idea?
I think if you are a quick reader, quick enough reader, then yes,
Hmm.
then there is some
Okay.
validity to that.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Anything else on this topic that you wanted to make sure that we included today?
Mm. Um, a lot of it has to do with what the kids are learning in school as well, and how advanced they are.
Right.
If you're starting with a kid that's in the middle of algebra 2, it may be better to do the ACT, right? But the kids who are in calculus already get some of the theoretical bits. They've learned some of the theory behind all of the math just in there. They probably have a little understanding of it, even if they can't express it because they're more advanced. So they might be better off with the SAT. But that's not a hard and fast rule. I've had plenty of exceptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Lori Goldstein from Circle Test Prep. And you can get a free trial of Achievable's ACT course by going to achievable.me. Use the code podcast to get 10% off.